She was 72 years old. She had built a company from nothing. She had raised a son on her own, buried a husband she loved, and sat at the head of a boardroom for nearly 5 decades. She had survived things that would have broken most people twice her age. But on a cold Tuesday morning in November, Eleanor Donovan did something that none of her employees, none of her rivals, and none of her family ever saw coming. She died. Except she didn't. She was sitting in a rented apartment in Philadelphia, 31 miles away, watching her own name scroll across the bottom of a news ticker. And she was waiting to see what the people she had spent her whole life loving would do the moment they believed she was gone. What happened next is something she never fully recovered from. Before we go any further, before we get into the details of what Eleanor saw, what she discovered, and what she did about it, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones nobody else is talking about. And this one, in particular, is one you are going to want to see all the way through to the end. Stay with us. Eleanor Donovan was born in 1951 in Columbus, Ohio, the second of 3 children raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked the line at a steel plant. There was no family money, no safety net, no inheritance waiting at the end of anyone's life. What her parents gave her instead was something harder to quantify, a belief, stated clearly and often, that if you worked for something with everything you had, the world had no choice but to make room for you. Eleanor took that belief seriously. She took it more seriously than anyone around her expected. By the time she was 20, she was working 2 jobs and taking night classes in business administration. By 24, she had saved enough to lease a small commercial space on the outskirts of Columbus and open a supply distribution business out of a garage that doubled as her office. Most people who knew her then will tell you the same thing. Nobody thought it would last. The business climate in the mid-1970s was brutal for small operators, and the industrial supply sector was almost exclusively dominated by men who had been doing it for decades. Eleanor walked into rooms where she was the only woman and usually the youngest person present, and she refused to let either of those facts become an excuse. She drove her own deliveries. She personally called every client who had a complaint. She extended credit to small contractors when the bigger suppliers wouldn't and built loyalties that would sustain her company for the next 4 decades. By the time Eleanor Donovan was 35, Donovan Industries had 40 employees and 3 distribution contracts with regional manufacturers. It was no longer a garage operation. It was a real business. And it was only getting started. By the mid-1990s, Donovan Industries had become one of the more quietly powerful mid-size industrial supply companies in the Midwest. Eleanor had grown it through a combination of discipline, personal relationships, and an almost stubborn refusal to overextend. She had watched competitors chase acquisition deals and fast growth and collapse under the weight of their own ambition. She moved carefully, expanded deliberately, and never took on debt she didn't need. Her reputation in the industry was built on one simple principle. If Eleanor Donovan told you something was going to happen, it happened. That reputation was worth more than any advertising budget. It brought her contracts, partnerships, and a kind of institutional trust that money simply cannot manufacture. And by the time she was 60, the company was valued at just under $340 million. She had built all of it herself. Thomas Donovan came into the world in 1975, 2 years before his father, Robert, and Eleanor finally admitted that their marriage had become something neither of them recognized anymore. The divorce was quiet, as Eleanor preferred things to be. Robert remarried within the year and moved to Arizona. He was a decent man who was simply not built for the life Eleanor was building, and both of them knew it. Thomas grew up watching his mother work. He watched her leave early and come home late. He watched her take phone calls at the dinner table and drive to the warehouse on weekends when something went wrong. If there was a theme to his childhood, it was this. His mother's company was always present, always demanding, and always, in some fundamental way, more urgent than anything else. He never said it out loud, but he noticed it, and he filed it away. Thomas was charming in the way that people who have spent their lives watching powerful figures tend to become charming. He understood instinctively how to read a room, how to make people feel seen without actually paying attention to them, and how to position himself in a conversation so that he always appeared to be the most reasonable person present. He joined Donovan Industries at 32, after a decade of middling success in financial consulting that had taught him everything about how wealth worked and nothing about how to build it. Eleanor made him vice president of operations. She believed in earned trust, but she also believed in blood, and she told herself honestly, the way people tell themselves things they need to believe, that Thomas had grown into someone she could count on. She would spend years paying the price for that belief. Vivian Caldwell had grown up in Connecticut, the daughter of a family whose money was old enough that nobody discussed it directly. She met Thomas at a charity event in Chicago in 2003 and married him 14 months later. Eleanor attended the wedding. She smiled in every photograph. She gave a toast that was warm and precise and revealed almost nothing about what she actually thought. What Eleanor actually thought, she told only one person. Harold Forbes, her attorney of 31 years, a man so steady and deliberate that he had become less a professional relationship and more a fixed point in the geography of her life. She told Harold that Vivian was smart, that she was strategic, and that she had married Thomas with a clear understanding of what he stood to inherit. Harold wrote nothing down. He simply nodded. He had known Eleanor long enough to understand when she was right about something. Sophie Donovan was 26 years old and working as a registered nurse at a hospital in Pittsburgh when her grandmother died. She was Thomas's daughter from a brief relationship in his late 20s, a fact that Eleanor had absorbed without drama and responded to with the same quiet consistency she applied to most things. When Sophie was 3, Eleanor stepped in. When Sophie was 7, Eleanor started paying her school fees. When Sophie was 18 and deciding between nursing and pre-med, it was Eleanor she called, not Thomas. Their relationship had grown into something that neither of them fully discussed, but both of them understood. A mutual recognition that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with genuine affection. Sophie called her grandmother every Sunday. Not always for long. Just to talk. Eleanor lived for those calls more than she ever admitted to anyone. It started with a hallway. That is where most of the worst things start. Not in dramatic moments of confrontation, but in ordinary spaces where someone says something they believed was private. It was October, a Sunday dinner at Eleanor's estate in Westerville. Thomas and Vivian had arrived with a bottle of wine and the kind of warmth that well-practiced people produce on command. Eleanor had excused herself to take a call and was walking back through the kitchen hallway when she heard them talking in the dining room. The words came through clearly. They were not arguing. They were planning. They were discussing the company, the board structure, the projected timeline, and the steps that would need to happen after she was gone. Not if she was gone. After. The specificity of it was what struck her. This was not a passing conversation. This was a conversation that had happened before. She stood in that hallway for 4 minutes. She would tell Harold Forbes later that she counted them. For minutes in a kitchen hallway, listening to her son and daughter-in-law discuss her death the way a project manager discusses a quarterly deliverable. She did not walk in. She did not say a word. She turned around, went back to her study, and sat in her chair for a long time in the dark. The question she kept asking herself was not what they had said. She had heard that clearly enough. The question was how long. How long had they been having that conversation? How long had Sunday dinners and birthday calls and easy laughter been happening alongside something she had never once been invited to see? When the answer came to her, it came not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A slow, cold settling in the chest that she recognized as the end of something. 3 weeks after that hallway, Eleanor sat down with Harold Forbes in his office on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus and said 4 words she had never said before in her life. I want to disappear. Harold looked at her for a long moment. He was 68 years old and had seen most things. He asked her to explain what she meant. She did. She told him about the hallway, about what she had heard, about the months of suspicion that had preceded it, and the growing sense that the people she had built her life around were not the people she had believed them to be. She wanted to know the truth. Not a version of it filtered through reassurances or explanations or the particular way people reframe their behavior when they know they have been caught. She wanted to see what they would actually do. She wanted to know who they actually were. Harold Forbes did not talk her out of it. He asked every practical and legal question a 31-year attorney should ask. He raised concerns, flagged complications, walked her through consequences. She had answers for most of it, and a steady willingness to accept the rest. What she proposed was this: a legally constructed death, a convincing will, a death certificate obtained through a private medical arrangement in Vermont citing cardiac arrest, and a 6-month window in which she would observe her family from a safe distance while Harold managed the estate proceedings on her behalf. She would be housed under a different name in an apartment in Philadelphia. She would have access to a secure phone line. She would not contact anyone except Harold. And she would document everything she saw. Harold agreed. He also told her, quietly, at the end of that meeting, that he hoped she would find what she was looking for. She told him she was not sure she did. The death certificate for Eleanor Donovan was filed on November 14th. The cause listed was cardiac arrest. She had a documented history of heart arrhythmia that made the story entirely plausible, and the private medical facility in Vermont that processed the paperwork had done so with the kind of clinical detachment that asked no questions it did not need to ask. By 9 a.m. that morning, Harold had contacted the estate attorney, the company's board secretary, and Eleanor's closest personal assistant, a woman named Ruth who had worked for her for 19 years and who cried on the phone for 11 minutes. Eleanor was in a sedan on the I-76 heading east. She had a single rolling suitcase, a laptop, a prepaid phone, and the small black notebook she had bought at a drugstore in Westerville the morning she left. She had already labeled the 2 columns inside the front cover. What I hoped. What actually happened? She arrived at the apartment in Philadelphia at noon. It was a 3rd-floor unit in a quiet building in the Rittenhouse area. Harold had leased it under the name Ellen Davis, a name Eleanor had chosen herself. Half out of practicality and half out of some dry private humor, she did not bother to explain. The apartment was clean, modest, and entirely anonymous. She unpacked her suitcase in 20 minutes. She made coffee. She sat by the window and watched the street for a while, and then she opened her laptop and began the work of being dead. The first thing she found was a news brief on a Columbus business website confirming the passing of Eleanor Donovan, founder and CEO of Donovan Industries. The second thing she found, 40 minutes later, was a post on Thomas's LinkedIn page describing his mother as a visionary leader and sharing his deepest gratitude for her guidance. He had posted it within 3 hours of the death certificate being filed. The funeral took place 4 days after the death certificate was processed. Eleanor had not planned to attend in any form. But on the morning of the service, she found herself in a rental car, parked across the road from the estate, with a pair of binoculars resting in her lap. She told herself it was research. She told herself she needed to see the beginning in order to understand what followed. What she saw was a service that was, by any objective measure, well organized. Thomas had hired an event coordinator. There were white orchids everywhere, which she noted because she had never once in her life expressed a preference for orchids and had mentioned, on multiple occasions over multiple years, that she preferred roses. There was a catered reception. There were speeches. She recognized most of the faces. And by the time the second round of drinks had been poured, the gathering had a quality that she sat with for a long time before she found the word for it. The word was relief. Vivian wore a black dress from a boutique on Fifth Avenue that Eleanor recognized because Vivian had pointed it out at Christmas and said she wished she had occasion to buy it. It appeared that occasion had now arrived. Thomas moved through the reception with a composure that Eleanor found, if she was being precise about it, too complete. Grief does something to people's edges. It makes them uncertain. It interrupts the social fluency that most adults spend their lives cultivating. Thomas had none of that interruption. He shook hands, accepted condolences, and moved from group to group with the kind of practiced ease you bring to an event you have been mentally rehearsing for some time. 78 people attended. Eleanor watched for 2.5 hours. Then she drove back to Philadelphia. She opened her black notebook. She wrote Thomas's name at the top of the first page. In the column labeled what actually happened, she wrote one word: performance. Sophie arrived late. Eleanor almost missed her, a dark coat, a borrowed umbrella, for hours of Pennsylvania highway behind her eyes. She did not go inside immediately. She stood at the edge of the garden path for a long moment, and then she sat down on the stone bench near the rose bed where Eleanor had spent every quiet morning for the past 15 years. She sat there alone for a long time. She did not check her phone. She did not talk to anyone. The rain came down steadily, and she did not move. Eventually Thomas came to the door and said something to her, and she went inside. Eleanor watched all of it through the binoculars with her hands completely still. She did not write anything in the notebook for several minutes. When she finally wrote something under Sophie's name, it was not in either column. She wrote it at the bottom of the page, below both columns, in small letters. She stayed. Thomas called Harold Forbes at 7:30 p.m. on the evening of the burial. Not to ask about Eleanor's personal effects, not to inquire about the service arrangements, not to express anything that resembled grief or gratitude or the kind of reflection that a son might reasonably be expected to have on the day his mother was laid in the ground. He called to ask about the will. Specifically, he asked about the timeline for the board transition and whether the controlling interest transfer could be processed before the standard 30-day waiting period. Harold told him the process would follow standard legal procedure and that he would be in touch with details in due course. Thomas thanked him, said he understood completely, and ended the call. Harold sat at his desk for a while after that. Then he called the secure line in Philadelphia. He did not say much. He simply told Eleanor that Thomas had called. Eleanor said she already knew he would. She said she had written it down. Vivian made 2 phone calls on the night of the burial. Harold learned about them 3 weeks later through a contact in the estate administration process who had reason to know. The first call was to a real estate agent in Columbus, a woman who specialized in high-end estate properties. Vivian did not formally list the Westerville house that night, but she made the inquiry. She asked about process, about timing, about what a property of that size and history could realistically expect to yield in the current market. The second call was to an interior designer in New York with whom Vivian had worked on the renovation of her and Thomas's home in 2019. The nature of that conversation was not fully documented, but the designer's assistant later confirmed, to a third party, that it involved a discussion of what the Westerville estate might look like after certain renovations. These calls were made before 8 p.m. The burial had ended at 5:30. Before we go further into what Eleanor discovered next, and what she discovered next is the part of this story that changes everything, we want to pause and say this. If this story is resonating with you, if it is making you think about your own family and the people you have trusted with your life's work, you are not alone. This kind of thing happens more often than anyone wants to admit. And the reason we tell these stories is because the truth, however uncomfortable, has a value that silence does not. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We release new stories every week, and every single one of them is a story we believe deserves to be told. Now, back to Eleanor Donovan. Because what happened at the reading of the will is something that neither Harold Forbes nor anyone else in that room has ever fully forgotten. The will reading took place the afternoon following the funeral in Harold Forbes's conference room on the 14th floor. Thomas and Vivian sat on one side of the table. Sophie sat across from them, still wearing the same dark coat, still carrying the quiet that had followed her from the garden bench the previous day. 2 members of the Donovan Industries board attended as observers. Harold read the document in full without expression. Thomas inherited controlling interest in Donovan Industries, along with the Westerville estate and the majority of Eleanor's liquid assets, a figure, net of taxes and legal fees, that would land somewhere north of $220 million. He nodded when Harold read his name. A single, slow nod. The kind of nod that means you already knew and have been waiting for someone else to make it official. Vivian's hand moved to Thomas's arm and rested there for a moment. She was smiling slightly. It was a very controlled smile. Sophie received a trust valued at $4.2 million. The terms were specific. She would receive access to the principal only after 5 continuous years of employment in a public service role. The interest was available immediately for education or medical expenses. When Harold read the conditions, Sophie looked up from the table. Her eyes were red. She did not speak for several seconds. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, "That sounds exactly like something she would do." It was the only thing anyone in the room said that was not about money or logistics. Vivian received one item. A single leather-bound journal, 40 years of Eleanor's personal entries, spanning 5 decades of her life. Harold passed it across the table without comment. Vivian opened it there in the conference room, turning to the front page, where Eleanor had written one sentence in her careful, precise cursive. The sentence read, "I always knew who you were." Vivian closed the journal. She said nothing. Nobody spoke for 11 seconds. Harold counted them. Within 2 weeks of the will reading, Thomas had begun moving. His first formal action as controlling shareholder was to dissolve the legacy supplier partnership program that Eleanor had spent the better part of 15 years building. A network of 43 minority-owned and small business contractors across 5 states who had grown their operations in direct relationship with Donovan Industries. The dissolution was framed internally as a cost optimization measure. It was presented to the board as a strategic realignment. Thomas told the Columbus Business Journal, in a brief statement, that it represented a natural evolution of the company's procurement approach. Eleanor read that statement in her Philadelphia apartment at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee she did not finish. She sat for a long time after reading it. Then she opened her black notebook and wrote, in Thomas's column, beneath the word performance, 2 new words. He's accelerating. The second move Thomas made was quieter and considerably more dangerous. He initiated what were described internally as exploratory conversations with Meridian Capital Group, one of the 2 acquisition firms that Eleanor had formally rejected over the course of her tenure, the second rejection coming as recently as 3 years prior. After a proposal that she had told Harold was the most aggressively undervalued offer she had ever seen from a company that claimed to take her seriously, Thomas reached out to Meridian's managing director through a mutual contact. The nature of those conversations was not immediately visible to the board. They were positioned as routine relationship maintenance, the kind of casual industry contact that a new executive might reasonably engage in during a leadership transition. But Eleanor, from Philadelphia, had resources that Thomas did not know she retained. And what those resources began to surface was something far older and far more deliberate than a routine phone call. Among her late husband Robert's archive files that had been stored in the estate's private records room and that Thomas had accessed within days of the funeral, there were documents that Eleanor had not reviewed in years. When Harold was able to obtain copies through a discreet channel, he drove to Philadelphia and sat across from Eleanor at her small kitchen table and placed them in front of her without saying anything. The documents were communications between Thomas and Meridian Capital Group. They were dated 14 months before Eleanor's staged death. 14 months before the hallway conversation, before the Sunday dinner, before any of it. Thomas had been in contact with Meridian for over a year while Eleanor was alive, while she was running the company, while she was sitting across from him at board meetings and asking for his input on the company's strategic direction. He had been positioning Donovan Industries for acquisition before she was ever in the ground. Eleanor read the documents twice. Then she set them on the table and stood up and walked to the window. She stood there for a long time, long enough that Harold eventually said her name. She did not turn around immediately. When she did, her expression was composed in the particular way that very controlled people look composed when something inside them has shifted permanently. She told Harold to give her 24 hours. She needed to think. Harold drove back to Columbus. Eleanor stayed by the window for the rest of the evening. What she was processing was not just the betrayal itself. She had, at some level, been preparing for a version of that. What she was processing was the timeline. The year of dinners, calls, and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had happened while Thomas was quietly building the architecture of something she had never been invited to see. The loneliness of that, she would later say, was its own particular kind of grief. There was a second set of documents. Harold brought them on his second visit to Philadelphia, 3 days after the first. These were internal communications between Thomas, Vivian, and Gerald Shaw, Donovan Industries' chief financial officer, a man Eleanor had personally promoted 7 years ago after a decade of reliable service. The 3 of them had been engaged in a coordinated effort to document what they described, in their own communications, as the systemic underperformance of current leadership. They had compiled a file, figures, projections, comparative analyses, that was designed to support Meridian Capital Group's acquisition case by establishing that Donovan Industries had been held back by its founder's conservative management philosophy. They were building an argument, in writing, that Eleanor Donovan's judgment had cost her own company money. Her son and the CFO she had trusted had been constructing the case for her professional irrelevance while she was still in the building. Harold watched Eleanor read through the second set of documents with the kind of careful attention she had applied to every significant decision in her life. She read slowly. She did not react visibly until she reached the section of the communications in which Thomas and Gerald Shaw discussed the board's likely response to a leadership transition. Thomas had written, in an internal message, that the board's loyalty to Eleanor was primarily sentimental in nature and would dissolve quickly once the financial argument was clearly articulated. Eleanor read that sentence 3 times. Then she put the documents down, very carefully, the way you put something down when you are trying not to break it. She told Harold that she would need the names of every board member Thomas had spoken to informally over the preceding 18 months. Harold told her he would have the list by morning. She said thank you. She said it quietly, the way you say thank you when there is nothing else adequate to say. The journal had been Eleanor's final word, or so she intended it. She had given Vivian 40 years of her life in that leather-bound volume. Every ambition and doubt and private reckoning she had ever committed to paper, and the inscription on the front page was not a threat. It was a conclusion, a door being closed from the inside. What Eleanor had not anticipated was that Vivian would respond. Not to Eleanor, Vivian believed she was dead. She responded to Harold, in a sealed letter delivered to his office 3 weeks after the will reading, with instructions that it be filed with the estate's permanent records. Harold read it once, then drove to Philadelphia. He handed it to Eleanor without telling her what it said. He did not want to mediate her reaction to it. He wanted her to have it directly, without the buffer of another person's interpretation. Eleanor read it alone at her kitchen table while Harold waited in the living room. The letter was 4 pages long. Vivian had read every entry in the journal. She wrote that she had read it twice. She wrote that Eleanor had been right about her, not in every specific, but in the essential truth of what Eleanor had understood about who Vivian was and what she had wanted from the beginning. She wrote that she had not been dishonest with Thomas, but that she had not been honest with herself either, and that there was a difference between those two things that she had spent years refusing to examine. She wrote that she was sorry. She did not qualify the apology or explain it away or attach conditions to it. It was, by any reading, a genuine expression of remorse from a woman who had arrived at the truth too late to do anything useful with it. She did not stop what Thomas was doing. She did not call Sophie. She did not reach out to the board. She simply wrote 4 pages of honesty into a letter and sent it to a dead woman's lawyer. Eleanor sat with that letter for a long time. When she came back into the living room, she held it in both hands. She told Harold that it was the most painful thing she had read in years, and that it was painful not because it was full of cruelty, but because it was full of clarity that had arrived too late to matter. She went to her bag and retrieved the small black notebook. She opened it to the front page. She placed the letter inside the cover. She wrote nothing in either column, not in what I hoped and not in what actually happened. Instead, she wrote Vivian's name at the bottom of the page, below both columns, in the same small letters she had used for Sophie. And beside Vivian's name, she wrote 4 words. She knew. Too late. Harold read those 4 words from across the table and did not say anything for a while. Then he told Eleanor that it was time to talk about coming back. She had planned to stay dead for 6 months. She came back after 11 weeks. Not because the picture was complete. Not because she had seen everything she needed to see. She came back because she had seen enough, and because she was beginning to understand something she had not fully anticipated when she conceived the plan, that watching without the ability to act is its own form of suffering. Every document Harold brought her, every phone call she was not able to make, every board member being quietly influenced while she sat in Philadelphia with her black notebook and her cold coffee, all of it accumulated into something heavier than she had the capacity to carry indefinitely. She was 72 years old. She had been running on willpower and righteous certainty for 11 weeks. And she was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. She told Harold on a Thursday night that she would be ready to go back on Monday morning. Harold said he would make the arrangements. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without ceremony, simply as a fact that needed to become true. On the morning of February 3rd, Eleanor Donovan walked through the front entrance of Donovan Industries Columbus headquarters at 8:15 a.m. She was wearing her coat. She was carrying her briefcase. Her hair was cut slightly shorter than before. She looked, by every account of everyone who was present that morning, exactly like herself. The woman at the reception desk, a young woman named Angela who had been with the company for 2 years, looked up from her desk, looked at Eleanor, looked back down at her desk, and then looked up again. The second look lasted approximately 3 seconds. Then Angela said, in a voice that the two other people in the lobby described as very small, "Mrs. Donovan?" Eleanor said, "Good morning, Angela." Angela fainted. She was unhurt. She would later describe the moment to her colleagues as the most surreal experience of her working life, which, given everything that followed that morning, was a reasonable assessment. The meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Harold had arranged it the previous Friday with Thomas's assistant, describing it as an urgent matter requiring the presence of Thomas, Vivian, and Gerald Shaw in the main conference room. He gave no further detail. Thomas arrived first, followed by Vivian, followed by Shaw. They were seated at the conference table when Eleanor walked through the door. The sequence of reactions in the room happened very quickly and in a very specific order. Shaw turned the color of paper. Vivian's hand moved to her throat. Thomas's face went through shock, then something that Eleanor later described to Harold as calculation, a rapid, almost visible process of assessment, and then a final settling into an expression she did not have a word for. She described it as the moment she saw the child she had raised become completely, finally, and permanently a stranger to her. She sat at the head of the table. She opened her briefcase. She placed Harold's compiled documentation, all of it, every communication, every financial analysis, every record of every conversation Thomas had conducted with Meridian Capital Group and Gerald Shaw while Eleanor was alive and after, in the center of the table. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice in a boardroom, and she was not going to start now. She told Thomas that she was presenting him with two options. Option 1. He would resign his position immediately, sign a full transfer of controlling interest back to Eleanor, and accept a severance arrangement that Harold had already drafted, in exchange for which the documentation on the table would remain in Harold's possession and no formal legal action would be initiated. Option 2. She would convene an emergency board meeting within 24 hours and present every document in that pile to the full board and to the company's general counsel. Thomas chose option 1. He made that choice in approximately 90 seconds. Eleanor had expected it to take longer. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the severance terms, both of which Harold answered. Then he signed the documents Harold produced from his own briefcase, documents that had been prepared and notarized in advance because Harold Forbes had known Eleanor Donovan for 31 years and understood that when she said she was going to do something, she had already done most of the work. Thomas was out of the building by 11:50 a.m. Vivian left with him. At the door of the conference room, Vivian paused. She turned and looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with the particular expression of a person who is deciding whether to say something they know will make no practical difference. She decided against it. She turned and walked out. Eleanor watched her go. She did not say anything either. Gerald Shaw was terminated by end of day. The matter was referred to the company's legal team for a full review of the financial records under his management. 2 board members who had been in contact with Thomas during the acquisition discussions were asked to step down and did so without public incident. Eleanor convened a full board meeting the following week, at which she presented a restoration plan for the supplier partnership program that Thomas had dissolved. The board approved it unanimously. The Meridian Capital Group discussions were formally closed. Eleanor issued a single public statement, 3 sentences, drafted by Harold, reviewed by Eleanor once, and distributed without revision. It said that she was resuming leadership of Donovan Industries, that the company's strategic direction remained unchanged, and that she looked forward to continuing the work. She did not explain her absence. She did not invite questions. The statement was exactly as long as it needed to be and not a word longer. The hardest call she made was not to the board, not to the attorneys, not to the press. It was to a nurse's station on the 3rd floor of a hospital in Pittsburgh, placed at 11:04 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 days after she walked back through the doors of Donovan Industries. She had been thinking about how to make that call for the entire 11 weeks she had been in Philadelphia. She had written drafts of it in the black notebook and crossed them all out. There was no good version. There was no way to explain what she had done that would not sound, to someone who had genuinely grieved, like something close to cruelty. Sophie picked up on the second ring. She said hello in the tone of someone who is accustomed to late calls from the hospital and is already preparing for bad news. Eleanor said her name. Just Sophie. Nothing else. There was a silence on the line that lasted several seconds. Then Sophie said, "Grandma?" Eleanor said she was sorry. She said it first, before anything else, because it was the only thing she was certain of in that moment. Sophie was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not emptiness but the opposite of it, too full of things arriving at once to select any individual response. Finally Sophie said, "Are you okay? Not where have you been? Not how could you? Not what does this mean? Are you okay?" Eleanor had her hand over her mouth by the time those 3 words arrived. She had sat in boardrooms for nearly 50 years without once losing her composure in front of another person. She had buried a husband and rebuilt a company and stood in a hallway and listened to her own son plan her obsolescence and said nothing. But 3 words from a 26-year-old nurse in Pittsburgh, and Eleanor Donovan had to press her hand against her mouth in the dark of a Philadelphia apartment so that Sophie would not hear her cry. It was the most honest moment of her life. Eleanor Donovan resumed full control of Donovan Industries in the first week of February. She restructured the board, reversed every decision Thomas had made in his 11 weeks of leadership, reinstated the supplier partnerships with personal calls to each of the 43 business owners affected, and quietly established a new education trust, separate from the one Harold had already structured, that would make a full medical school scholarship available to Sophie if she ever chose to pursue it, with no conditions attached and no 5-year waiting period. She told Harold about the trust on a Friday afternoon. Harold wrote it up and filed it the same day. He did not say anything about it beyond the professional formalities, which was precisely what Eleanor needed from him and precisely what he always provided. They had worked together for 31 years. Very little between them required explanation. She never reconciled with Thomas. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, within 6 months of leaving Columbus, a fact that Eleanor noted without comment when Harold mentioned it. They did not speak. There were no letters, no intermediaries, no quiet attempt at repair from either direction. Eleanor did not seek it. She was not, by temperament or by the particular arithmetic of what had happened, a person who confused acceptance with forgiveness or silence with peace. She had accepted what Thomas was. She did not require him to be different. She simply required that he be at a sufficient distance. 6 months in Scottsdale was, for her purposes, sufficient. She did not think about him daily. She thought about him the way you think about a chapter that is over, present in the history of the book, but not where you are reading anymore. She and Sophie had dinner every Sunday. They met at the estate, where Eleanor had finally gotten around to replanting the garden. Not the formal, symmetrical arrangement that had been there before, but something less structured and more living. Roses, primarily. Red ones. They did not, as a rule, discuss what had happened. Sophie had questions that she kept to herself, out of a consideration for Eleanor that Eleanor recognized and was grateful for. What they discussed instead was Sophie's patience, and the particular kind of exhaustion and satisfaction that nursing produces in people who are built for it. They discussed old movies and the garden and a book Eleanor was reading about the agricultural history of the Ohio Valley that Sophie found baffling and Eleanor found legitimately interesting. They discussed, on one Sunday in early spring, whether Sophie had ever thought about medical school. Sophie said she had thought about it. Eleanor said good. That was the entire conversation. Neither of them needed it to be longer. The small black notebook stayed in the top drawer of Eleanor's desk at the estate. She never added to it after Philadelphia. The 2 columns, what I hoped and what actually happened, remained exactly as she had filled them during those 11 weeks, incomplete and accurate in the way that documentation of human behavior is always incomplete and always, in its incompleteness, accurate. The only entries that did not fit neatly into either column were the 2 she had written at the bottom of the page in small letters. Sophie's name, which she stayed beside it, and Vivian's name, which she knew too late beside it. Eleanor kept the journal inside the notebook's cover. She kept it because it was true, and because true things deserve to be kept even when they are also painful, and because there is a difference, one Eleanor had spent her life learning to understand, between keeping something and being held by it. She told Harold Forbes, in the winter of the year she turned 73, sitting in his office on a late afternoon when the light was low and neither of them was in a hurry, that she wished she had never found out. Not because it wasn't real, not because the truth had failed her, but because she had lived, for most of her life, with the capacity to hope, to believe, in the part of herself that she had never fully rationalized away, that the people around her were better than the evidence suggested. She had traded that hope for certainty. And certainty, she told Harold, is a much colder thing to live with. Harold listened to all of it. He said, when she was finished, that he thought she was probably right. He also said that he thought she already knew that before she made the plan. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that he was probably right too. They sat for a while after that without saying anything. The light went down. Neither of them moved to turn on the lamp. What do you do with the truth once you have it? That is the question Eleanor Donovan spent the rest of her life sitting with. She had wanted it completely, without mediation or softening, and she had gotten exactly that. She had seen her son for who he was. She had seen her daughter-in-law arrive at honesty 4 pages and 1 leather journal too late. She had seen a CFO she trusted align himself with the person who stood to gain the most from her absence. And she had seen a 26-year-old nurse sit alone in the rain on a stone bench and stay. She had the full picture, every column filled. And the thing she discovered, in the quiet years that followed, was that having the full picture did not make the world easier to live in. It made it smaller. It made it quieter. It removed the uncertainty that had always carried, inside it, the possibility of being wrong. And being wrong, she now understood, had always been the thing that made hope possible. Here is what we want to leave you with tonight. Eleanor Donovan built $340 million of enterprise value over 46 years. She survived hostile markets and personal loss and the particular loneliness of being a woman who refuses to apologize for her own competence. She outwitted her own son, dismantled the plan he had been building for over a year, and walked back through the front doors of her own company with a briefcase and a settled expression and the full weight of what she knew. By any measure, she won. And she will tell you, she told Harold Forbes, on a quiet afternoon in the winter of her 73rd year, that winning felt nothing like she thought it would. That the truth she had risked everything to obtain was real and accurate, and entirely without comfort. That she spent the rest of her life wishing she had stayed in the hallway. That some doors, once you open them, do not close again. And that she would give a great deal, to have spent those 4 minutes in the kitchen simply walking through. So we'll leave you with this. If you could know, right now, tonight, with complete and irrefutable certainty, exactly how the people you love most would behave the moment they believed you were gone, would you want to know? Think about that. And let us know in the comments what you think Eleanor should have done differently. We genuinely want to hear from you. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about trust or legacy or the particular cost of needing to be certain, then you are exactly the reason this channel exists. These are the stories we don't tell. The ones that live behind the smiles at the dinner table and the toasts at the funeral and the careful language of the will reading. Subscribe if you haven't already, and stay close. Because the next story we're bringing you starts with a man who gave his business partner everything, his name, his reputation, his life's work, and ends in a place that nobody who knew him saw coming. We'll see you there.